Well, today's scripture is the Gospel of John, chapter 9, verses 1 through 41. Woo! That's right, it's a long one. It's a long narrative, and it's a complicated narrative in the Gospel of John, this particular section. There's some problematic things in it, and we're going to talk about, but what I want you to think about and keep in mind as you listen is that it kind of, notice that it begins with this, as he walked along, which kind of evokes, at least to me, sort of just this like kind of calm, sort of has a calm feel to it, you know. But I want you to keep in mind that right before this, just keep this in mind as you listen, right before this section, chapter 9, Jesus has been in the temple, and he's been kind of under attack and being questioned and threatened, and they get so mad at him because he is saying that he knows God and that he knows who Abraham is, and they say, well, you're only 50 years old. How can you possibly know? You're not even 50 years old is what they say. And how can you possibly know? And then they get so angry with him that they pick up stones, they start to stone him. Just keep in mind that's what's just happened. And by the way, just to keep in mind also that stoning in this ancient tradition is a form of, to stone someone to death. It is to call them a sinner, to consider them a sinner, and there are certain sins that are worthy of stoning, and we suspect probably they suspect Jesus of blasphemy. But isn't that interesting? Just keep that in mind, that Jesus was called an abomination and was stoned. He escaped. I don't want to spoil it for you, but he didn't get stoned that time. He hid himself. He hid himself and left. And then it picks up here. As he walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed to him in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. When he had said this, he spat on the ground and made mud with his saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes, saying to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. Then he went and washed and came back able to see. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar began to ask, is this not the man who used to sit and beg? Some were saying, it is he. Others were saying, no, but it is someone like him. He kept saying, I am the man. But they kept asking him, then how were your eyes opened? He answered, the man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. Then I went and washed and received my sight. They said to him, where is he? He said, I do not know. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also began to ask him how he had received his sight. He said to them, he put mud on my eyes, then I washed, and now I see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not observe the Sabbath. But others said, how can a man who is a sinner perform such signs? And they were divided. So they said again to the blind man, what do you say about him? It was your eyes he opened. He said, he is a prophet. The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight And they asked him, "Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?" His parents answered, "We know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but we do not know how it is that he now sees. Nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore, his parents said, "He is of age, ask him." So for the second time, they called the man who had been blind, and they said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." He answered, "I do not know whether he is a sinner. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." They said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered them, "I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?" Then they reviled him, saying, "You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but for this man, we do not know where he comes from." The man answered, "Here is an astonishing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to one who worships him and obeys his will. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." They answered him, "You were born entirely in sins, and are you trying to teach us?" And they drove him out. Jesus heard that they had driven him out, and when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "And who is he, sir? Tell me so that I may believe in him." Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he." He said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshiped him. Jesus said, "I came into this world for judgment so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind." Some of the Pharisees near him heard this and said to him, "Surely we are not blind, are we? Are we?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would not have sinned. But now that you say, 'We see,' your sin remains." May the hearing of these words add insight and blessing to your lives. Whew, that's complicated. There's a whole lot going on. So first, a couple of things I want to point out. First, I want to remind you that oftentimes the Gospel of John is misinterpreted in a way that empowers people to anti-Semitism. So, for example, Hitler used the Gospel of John to justify the Holocaust. So let's just make sure that we're not taking John's words out of context and assuming that when he talks about the Jews and he uses that language that we're not hearing that in the way that it's not intended to be heard. John was Jewish, as was Jesus, and John was critical of the larger community. He was in conversation with, as a Jewish person, he was in conversation with the Jewish community. So when he is using that language, he's not condemning or being anti-Semitic. He's not condemning Judaism. He's criticizing in a way. For example, if I were to be in conversation or say something about Christian nationalism or another way of Christianity that theologically I was in disagreement with and we were in conversation, I would be not condemning Christianity, but being in conversation with that community about the differences. So just let's make sure we're clear on that. The other piece that can really be tricky in this is that there is this issue of disability, right? That the blind man needs to be healed, and that he's born blind so that God could show everybody this power, and that can be problematic. I just want to point that out, that in our world now, where we have a 21st century kind of understanding of recognizing disability in different ways, and not just assuming that disability is or difference is a disability, that I just want to honor and recognize that there is a problematic element in this around disability. Now, let me point out some things I think we should pay attention to, too. Actually, before I do that, let's hear some. Yeah.
Here we are, standing on the corner of Walk, Don't Walk. You look away from me, trying not to catch my eye, but you didn't turn fast enough, did ya? You don't like my raspy voice, do you? I got this raspy voice 'cause I have to yell all the time 'cause nobody around here ever listens to me. You don't like that I scratch so much. Yes, and excuse me, I scratch so much 'cause my neurons are on fire. And I admit my smile is not at its Pepsodent best, 'cause I think my caps must have somehow got osteoporosis. And if my eyes seem to be twirling around like flies, the better to see you with, my dears. Look at me, you mammalian brain lunkheads. I'm not just talking to myself, I'm talking to you too. And to you, and 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 you. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking I'm crazy. You think I give a hoot? You people look at my shopping bags, call me crazy because I saved this junk? What should we call the ones who buy it? It's my belief we all, at one time or another, secretly ask ourselves the question, am I crazy? And in my case, the answer came back a resounding yes. You're thinking, how does a person know if they're crazy or not? Well, sometimes you don't know. Sometimes you can go through life suspecting you are, but never really knowing for sure. Sometimes you know for sure because you got so many people telling you you're crazy that it's your word against everybody else's. Another sign is when you see life so clear sometimes, you black out. This is your typical visionary variety who has flashes of insight but can't get anyone to listen to them because their insights make them sound so crazy.
It's a monologue from The Search for Intelligent Life in the Universe by Jane Wagner. Lily Tomlin performed it on Broadway. Anyway, probably because how often do we refuse to listen to anybody or anything that is outside of our comfort zone? You know, just outside of what we think our worldview. How often does that happen? It happened to Jesus, really. That's really what's happening, right? He's coming into the world. Let me remind you of John's theology. John is not apocalyptic like Mark and Matthew. John and Luke. John's theology is really that the world is, think of it as a two-story house, and the upstairs is where all the goodness, all the heavens, the God, the light, all the stuff that is associated with God and the realm of God. And the lower level is where we reside, and it's really kind of dark, and people are blind. Anytime you hear John talk about somebody being blind, and there's a lot of blind people in the Gospel of John, if you sit down and read it. There's a lot of, Jesus is dealing with people who are physically blind, but what he's really talking about is spiritual blindness. So it's always the person who is physically blind is really the person who truly sees. And it's the people who really have physical vision who are the ones that are spiritually blind, because they're in that darkness. And so God has sent Jesus down into that lower level to bring light. And so anybody who's willing to see this light and respond to the light and is drawn to the light gets to see, gets to carry the light then and become a light themselves. And in John's theology, there's a limited time for how long Jesus is going to be down here. You hear Jesus say it, I'm the light of the world as long as I'm here. And what the theology is that I will be leaving soon, right? He talks about the death of how the Son of Man must die. That light will be withdrawn back up to the upper level. So he's down bringing this message, this message of God, this light into this world that has lost its true vision, hoping that people will grasp it and see it. And he's bumping up against the powers that be, right? We talk about the Pharisees. The Pharisees, they're very religious people. They're very devout, religious people. They study the law. They study Torah. They study the law. It's important to them to understand and to maintain these laws, right? These rites and rituals and laws. With good reason. They have thousands of years of history of showing that, this is what has carried them through. And so the Pharisees are they've become so focused on the laws that Jesus would say they're blind. That's what's happening in this text. The blind man is not really blind. The blind man in the story is the only person who sees. Sort of like Trudy, the bag lady standing on the corner, the only one who's really seeing the madness of the world. And people call her crazy. How many times have you felt or wondered in your life where you could see something so clearly, and you look around and you just, nobody else seems to be reacting to that or troubled by it or in any way, and you feel like completely at odds? Has that ever happened to you? How many times have you experienced true insight? We've really had this awakening and seen in a new way. You know what I'm talking about? I'm not talking about actual vision, because Jesus isn't really talking about actual vision. He's talking about seeing spiritually, being awake and alive spiritually, being drawn to the light of God's realm. I had a conversation the other day with a man who's 90 years old, and he was dealing with a pretty tough situation. He's in the hospital, and he said to me, "Oh, you're a chaplain. You're going to have a hard time with me. I don't go for that stuff at all." I'm not into God and all that stuff. And I said, oh, okay, well, tell me about that. He had a really interesting, lovely story about, why he doesn't believe in God and why it hasn't been useful. And essentially, it boiled down to nobody's really been able to prove that God does exist, and he hasn't really found it important in his life. But he's in this really tough time now with he and his wife. And I said, well, so what gives you hope? And he looked at me and he said, hope? I'm 90 years old. What do I need hope for? There is no hope. That's what he said. I thought it was kind of funny and kind of sad. And yet, he actually, even though he wasn't using the language that I would couch hope and love and what God means to me and all of that, he wasn't using that language. He actually seemed to be doing okay. I'm just telling you some things I noticed. So then I had a conversation with a man who was living what they like to call housing insecure, which means he doesn't have a home. It just makes us feel better to say housing insecure. It cleans it up, makes it tidy. He's homeless on the streets, and when he leaves the hospital, that's where he will be returned to. And he was telling me how every person in his life that has had any meaning to him, that any significant person, any significant relationship has died within the last 5 years. His family, his friends, not one person is remaining. Everyone has died. And he said, he's probably in his 40s. What do I need hope for? There is no hope. He's very depressed and sad. But then I have a conversation with another person who had this amazing experience. They have been through this experience that is profound, where they had a medical emergency. They were in the ICU for a really long time. It looked as if there was no hope. They were intubated. And for some miraculous reason, they recovered. And it's really profound. They're just really processing it and having this profound experience. And part of the processing, he says, well, my eyes were opened. I was completely out, unconscious for however many days, weeks. But in that time, I felt like my eyes were open for the first time in my life. I felt like I could feel God's presence. I could just feel it. I don't know how to explain it, but I could feel something opening up. And when I literally opened my eyes and took my first breath after the breathing tube came out, I could see differently. I saw things. I saw my relationships with people I care about and love differently. I could see how things I had done in the past were really harmful, even though I didn't intend them to be harmful, but that my relationship and how I was dealing with people was making things really hard. And he's like, I don't know how to grab this and express this, except that I can see differently. And I thought, isn't that amazing? I thought about the blind man in the Gospel of John. To be able to see differently. To have that moment where you can really see something in a whole new way, in a way you have never even thought or conceived it before. To experience God's presence and to be transformed by it. Think about that line, what will you do with your one wild, like that Mary Oliver says? What What will you do with this one wild, magical life that you've been given? What will you do? If you could see, if you have the insight to see differently, if your eyes are opened, if you can recognize God's presence and see the world, you could focus, you can focus on all the negative. It's easy to do. I can go there easily. There's so much sorrow and brokenness in this world. There's war, there's famine, there's earthquakes, there's illness, there's addiction, there's this overwhelming thing at work that feels overwhelming and depressing. You can focus on that, and that's how you can see the world. Or you can be drawn and let the light, be drawn into this light that Jesus brings into our presence, that we can be encompassed and folded in and see some goodness and hope. I wonder, on this fourth Sunday of Lent, as we are inching our way closer out of this wilderness experience, I wonder if you will be open. I wonder if you will be open to seeing in a new way. I wonder. I hope, that's the invitation, that you would just really allow yourself to see something in a new way. Take a deep breath when you're in the midst of something that's weighing heavy, that you just can't, like we get really caught up in, just can't see a way through, can't see the end game, can't see, we use that language often, I just can't see it. Take a step back, take a deep breath, and invite God's presence. Invite God to open your eyes. Invite Jesus to pick up the mud. Mud, saliva. Ugh. You want to be healed by having somebody wipe saliva and mud on your eyes? Something kind of raw and dirty about it, but it's honest and earthy and personal and intimate, and to allow God to touch you in a way that would really, truly open. I invite you just to experiment this week with a new vision. Sometimes, like the Pharisees, not only were the Pharisees in this story, not only were they blind, what Jesus is saying, that they are the ones who really are experiencing blindness. The person who was born blind is the one who sees. I don't know how well you were paying attention, but they also were deaf. They weren't hearing. He says, you're not hearing. I invite you to open your hearts, open your ears, open your eyes, and see what God might do in the midst of it all. Journey well.